Just 3 years after the release of Flight Simulator 2020, the extraordinary has become somewhat ordinary. What am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about nothing less than the game's graphics. Now, back in 2019, when we saw that original announcement trailer, people were shocked at the quality of the truly next generation of visuals. Today, the story is a little different. Whilst the graphics are still considered very good, some people out there, and just maybe they're trolls, consider them to be somewhat average and nothing particularly special. So yeah, things certainly have changed. Nonetheless, as our attention moves towards Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, the question of system requirements once again rears its head. Just how well is the game going to perform? There are some visual improvements. There's also some physics improvements as well, both in terms of aerodynamics as well as soft and hard body physics. So yes, it seems, on the surface at least, that new hardware is going to be required. Ultimately then, this is a speculation video. It's very difficult to try and speculate on what hardware requirements might be needed for an unreleased game. But that said, a lot of people have asked the question. There's a lot of interest about this out there, so let's try our best to try and figure things out. As such, I'm going to structure this video in the following way. Firstly, we're going to look at Microsoft's current claims about Flight Sim 2024. We're then going to look at the current situation with Flight Sim 2020 and the existing minimum hardware requirements. We'll look then at how well these work and then come to some questions about Flight Sim 2024. Some really tricky questions, quite unusual ones at that. And then the biggest question, can Microsoft really pull this off? Now, the really interesting thing here, and perhaps the most important thing, comes from Microsoft's FAQ that they released back in June. Now, they talk about here, you can see on the screen, will Microsoft Flight Simulator have improved loading times? And well, the bottom line is this will keep the minimum specifications of the sim as low as it is now, and will also reduce update and load times. What are they talking about? Well, nothing less than a big bunch of the game, a big bunch of the sim being moved to the cloud. One of the biggest priorities for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 is to improve the simulator's data management. One of the major changes to the simulator's architecture being made is using cloud streaming to help ensure that the client becomes thin. When users load into the sim, only the textures, meshes and map data that they need will be downloaded to avoid unnecessary bandwidth and disk space usage. Now, I'm not quite sure how that really affects the amount of GPU and CPU required. Obviously, understandably, it will affect the amount of space used on your hard drive. It will also affect the loading times because all of that, and download times, because all update times as well, I guess, because all of that will be coming from the cloud. But as to how the sim performs locally, well, unless Microsoft are planning on doing a load of those calculations in the cloud, I guess as they do now with photogrammetry, but for the rest of the sim, then just how are they going to manage to keep the specifications and system requirements as low as they are now? Graphics card wise, we're looking at a GTX 770 or a Radeon RX 570. These are both very old cards, the GTX 770 especially. Well, they're pretty low powered cards. The RX 570 isn't exactly what you'd call a cutting edge. The CPUs rather, are also pretty low spec here, Ryzen 3 1200. So yeah, these minimum system requirements were quite a surprise to me. I'd forgotten just how low Microsoft had set these. The question is then, can Microsoft retain these low minimum specs going forward? Well, we may be able to find an answer in the Xbox. The Xbox Series S is obviously the low-end hardware that Microsoft are going to be aiming for. They will need the game to be running on that hardware regardless of what they want it running on PC. Now, I checked a few websites here. What is the equivalent GPU that the Series S runs when you compare it to PC? Turns out we're looking at a Radeon 5500 XT, according to the website Video Gamer. Alternatively, over on TechEdged, we can see they kind of measure the equivalent to be around about the RX 580 or the RX 590. Now, I have played Flight Simulator on my Series S, and it runs pretty well. You can see some footage on the screen right here. The question remains though, just how well does the flight sim run on minimum PC specs, an RX 570. Well, fortunately, YouTube has us covered. The YouTube channel 54 FPS is running Microsoft Flight Simulator right here on an RX 570 with a Ryzen 5 2600. That's pretty close to minimum spec, certainly when it comes to the GPU. As expected, the frame rates are nothing really to write home about. We're getting an average frame rate of 21 frames per second over this fairly simple area, and 24 frames a second, 26 frames a second average. As things move on closer to Manhattan and the center of New York, things do pick up a little bit oddly. I'm getting a typical 30 frames per second and again 26 frames per second average, so not too shabby. And it doesn't really give us much of an indication as to what to expect from the next iteration of the sim. Now we do know there's some improved visuals. Just look at this, we can see some improved terrain and improved textures. A lot of other details going on here, such as trees and rocks. All of this is going to add to the GPU, maybe the CPU load. There's also some extra physics going on, and it's an extra load which will almost certainly be bogging down hardware, not to mention the Xbox, both the Series X as well as especially the Series S. But then I keep coming back to that question, that point that Microsoft raised. The idea that they're going to be using cloud streaming to ensure the client becomes thin. Is it possible they're going to have graphical as well as physics calculations going on in the cloud, and that all the benefits this might bring will be delivered via the internet to people? But if so, what does this mean for people who have a low internet connection? Would they be going without these features, or would they get some sort of cut down version? And if not, if all of this is going to be processed locally in terms of CPU and GPU calculations, just how are Microsoft going to ensure that they keep the specifications the same? Personally, I'm finding that this subject very difficult to grasp. I'm not quite sure how Microsoft are going to do it, and I'm not even entirely convinced that they will be able to do it. What do you think about this? Let me know in the comments section. Do you think Microsoft will be able to improve the quality of the sim visually and in terms of physics, whilst also maintaining the current system requirements? Seems like that's a bit of a hard push or a hard sell. Let me know what you think. But that said, it does open up another possibility. Microsoft have said that one of the reasons they're moving on to a Flight Simulator 2024 is because they've butted up against the edges of what is possible with the 2020 version. Now, many of us have taken that to mean that they want to improve the sim, both visually as well as in terms of physics, but there's another possibility here, isn't there? And that is that just maybe the code for Flight Sim 2020 has some fundamental problems, and that these have affected the ongoing bugs that haven't been corrected, and they've also affected the ongoing performance issues. Just maybe the client is written in such a way that these things can't easily be fixed, and that it would be much simpler just to completely refactor or rewrite the code. If that is the case, it would suggest that Flight Simulator as it exists today is still largely unoptimized. But Microsoft and Osobo are hoping to improve and optimize Flight Sim 2024 much further. If that were to be the case, and again this is entirely speculation, just me wondering out loud, but if it were to be true, then it could be a case that Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 works much better simply because 2020 is so poorly written. Could that be the possibility? Ultimately then, there's no easy answer here. We don't really know what to expect for future hardware requirements. Microsoft do seem to be insisting that they will be largely the same. They've said that twice, both on their FAQ in June and then later, a few weeks later, at the Flight Expo, the Flight Sim Expo 2023. Now, understandably, there is quite a lot of uncertainty out there about these claims. I'm also pretty uncertain about them myself. But like I say, what do you think? Let me know in the comments section. At any rate, there we have it. That brings us pretty much to the end of this video. I'm very curious to see just how Microsoft are going to pull this one off. Do let me know what you think about it all in the comments section below. I'd love to hear from you. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.